In this video, I'm going to pick two non-UFC champions who I think have the best chance against the current UFC champion in each male division. The UFC's monopoly on the best talent in MMA is at an all-time high, and you'd be pretty safe to say that the best fighter in a given division is the UFC champion. Accordingly, I'll be giving each non-UFC champion pick a rating based on how well I think they'd match up against the UFC champion, either as a heavy underdog, moderate underdog, slight underdog, and on the very rare occasion, near even. One last thing before we get started is that we do have to look at one championship who, due to their hydration requirements, have different weights for their divisions. In general though, I'm of the opinion that if you simply remove the hydration testing and allow fighters to water cut, the difference between one and the unified divisions is roughly the same and comparable enough, at least for this video. So with all that out of the way, let's start off with the Flyweight division. For Flyweight, there were definitely a few considerations. Even though Alexandre Pantoja has looked unbelievable, he is starting to push the upper limits of his physical prime in terms of age, and he has a lot of mileage throughout his career. Not in the top two, but I did give some thought to one strawweight champion, Joshua Pashao, but for our number 2 pick, I like ACA's champion, Kurban Gadzhiev. Kurban is the current champion of ACA, which might have the strongest flyweight division outside of the UFC. Kurban holds an MMA record of 20-3, with every fight in ACA and its predecessor, ACB. He is a tanky and incredibly strong fighter who is good everywhere with a great chin. He also has incredible cardio, especially for someone with his stocky build. I think in a matchup with Pantoja, he would get outclassed technically, but would put forward an impressive performance for himself. I would class him as a slight to moderate underdog. If Demetrius Johnson is the greatest flyweight to ever live, I would stand on the hill that Kyoji Horiguchi is second. The current flyweight champion in Rizin, Kyoji Horiguchi, for 8 years now has been the pinnacle of talent in the organization. Kyoji's recent performances, although relatively dominant, have shown he is losing a few yards of pace, now 34 in a weight class where that is a relatively old age. Kyoji and Pantoja are actually teammates in the American top team, so I'm willing to bet that this fight never happens publicly, but people with inside knowledge probably know how this matchup would go down in live competition. But to play the speculation game, against an also aging Pantoja, Kyoji offers a lot of problems for the UFC champion. Good enough in the grappling to not pull a Kai Asakura, but fast and sharp enough, well, to pull off a Kai Asakura. I think Kyoji Horiguchi would be a slight underdog against Pantoja, and I wouldn't be surprised if he could get something done. UFC Bantamweight champion Merab Dvalishvili looks pretty unstoppable at the moment, and he, outside of our number 1 pick, might have the largest gap between himself and the non-UFC champions. I like Fabricio Andrade in one championship, who just missed out on the number 2 spot, but for number 2 we are going with the Rizin champion, Naoki Inoue. When Naoki signed to the UFC from Deep, I remember the hype coming from the JMMA crowd that he was going to be their first UFC champion. And although it didn't exactly play out that way for Naoki, through wins and losses he has consistently been improving, and now at 27 he is entering his athletic peak as one of the top non-UFC talents in the division. Unfortunately though, Merab isn't a great stylistic matchup for Naoki, who is a long-footed division submission specialist, who has this unbelievable ability to get back takes from defensive positions. Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to be able to sprawl on Merab, especially in a cage. I like Naoki and he would be a real problem in the UFC Bantamweight division if he does return, but he would have to be a heavy underdog against Merab, and his only real shot would be a Hail Mary submission, especially under the unified MMA rules. The Bellator Bantamweight champion Patchy Mix is far and away the best Bantamweight champion not in the UFC. His 20-1 MMA record is filled with the names of some of the biggest and best fighters in the division, with his powerful wrestling and willingness to play submissions from bottom, combined with a more than competent stand-up, makes me believe he has the best chance of any other non-UFC champion, at least to not get steamrolled by Merab. Patchy is a long fighter and does a good job of fighting at a distance, forcing his opponents to shoot at range, where he can utilize his crafty grappling to get into more favorable positions. This isn't too dissimilar to Naoki from earlier, but just with better fundamental wrestling. I'd say Patchy should come in as a moderate to slight moderate underdog against Merab. Featherweight is one of the best divisions in MMA and has been for a long time. ACA's champion 16-0 Islam Omarov on his day could beat anyone in the division, and he might not even be in his peak yet. Bellator's champion Patricio Pitbull would have been a real contender for this list just a few years ago, and Rizin's champion Kleber Koki Herbs looked incredible last time out and has been improving exponentially. But for number 2, we are going with the first one championship champion on this list, Tang Kai. Tang Kai at 28 is entering his athletic peak and is looking like an absolute world beater at one championship. With a 79% finish rate, the Chinese wrestler has found a beautiful blend between his wrestling base and powerful striking, which sounds a bit like our familiar UFC champion who I think he is quite comparable to. To break it down simply, I'd say Tang Kai is a less developed, less skilled Illia Topuria, with a similar style and strengths. Accordingly, I think he should come in as a heavy underdog, but that's more to do with how amazing Illia has looked rather than anything to discredit Tang Kai. Losene Keita might be the most exciting prospect outside of the UFC, and if you disagree with that, it's likely because you no longer consider Octagon's 2-weight champion merely a contender anymore. When talking about the 16-1 featherweight and lightweight champion, you almost have to start at his unbelievable pure physical speed. The speed he can throw a jab or a straight from guard is comparable to professional boxers, and he has some beautiful Muay Thai fundamentals which rounds out his striking well. Keita's takedown defense and general grappling is impressive, but when compared to the UFC's elite, it would be something that he needs to work on, and in a matchup against Illia, he won't be able to muscle his way out of unfavorable positions. I'd say Losene Keita should come in as a moderate underdog against Topuria, but if you've never seen him fight before, you'd be surprised at how well the Octagon champion would look. Lightweight has been the golden division for MMA for at least a decade now, consistently hosting the sport's best talent. I again like Losene Keita, but he is definitely undersized compared to someone like Islam. Christian Lee, once champion, is still only 26 and has had a Hall of Fame career in one, and Roberto de Souza in Rizin would be a weird matchup against Islam, but for our number 2 pick we are going with ACA's lightweight champion, Abdul-Aziz Abdulvakhabov. Abdul-Aziz is currently 21-2 and he has defended the ACA lightweight championship 4 times. The fun thing about comparing these Russian Sambo-rooted fighters is that relatively it's fairly basic to speculate and compare them, in the sense that likely the most technical fighter will win. They are all insanely physically conditioned, fairly uniform in game plan strengths and styles, so it all just really cancels out to who has the best technique when doing what they do. So in saying that, let's just throw in the number 1 pick, which is Bellator's lightweight champion Usman Nurmagomedov. Obviously Usman and Islam are training partners, and Usman has expressed he isn't coming to the UFC until Islam is retired. But any of these 2 picks, Abdul-Aziz and Usman, would theoretically give the lightweight champion the biggest issues compared to any other non-UFC champion. Both should come in as light to moderate underdogs due to a lower strength of competition. Welterweight is another power division for MMA, and we are spoilt for choice with amazing champions to challenge Belal Muhammad. I particularly like Ramazan Nurmagomedov, who is Bellator's champion, but for our number 2 pick we are taking ONE's 2-weight champion Christian Lee. ONE's golden boy Christian Lee has been the MMA face of the organization for a majority of the organization's existence, and the fact he is only 26 and theoretically not even in his physical prime yet is insane. Christian is a natural finisher with heavy hands and slick grappling, a true product of someone who started MMA training young instead of transitioning from competing professionally in another combat sport. In his 17 MMA wins, he has only 1 victory via decision. Putting Christian up against Belal, I think people would be surprised at some of the grappling exchanges, but ultimately it's hard not to see a typical Belal 50-45 decision, and as much as I like Christian and rate his skills, you would have to put him as a heavy underdog against Belal. Is Shamil Musayev the best welterweight in the world? According to resume and strength of opposition, clearly the answer is no. But the eye test? Man looks like a world beater. PFL's 2024 welterweight tournament winner, Shamil's undefeated MMA record might not have names too recognizable to most Western audiences, but Shamil should have been on our radars for way longer than before this PFL run, and I'm surprised he wasn't picked up by more hardcore audiences during his time in KSW. Shamil has scary KO power with iron-clad takedown defense, a nightmare matchup for Belal. At 30 years old, Shamil is also in the middle of his theoretical physical peak, while Belal is theoretically leaving his prime at age 36. I think as MMA fans, we tend to underrate Belal as one of the best welterweights of a generation, but I don't know man, I'd take Shamil at near even odds or even as a slight favourite. Tell me that isn't crazy. Dricus du Plessis is such a strange fighter to play matchmaker for, where it's very hard but also somehow super easy to picture a matchup to beat him. Technically once middleweight champion Anatoly Malachin is a possible shout, but this is where one's weight classes make things a bit more difficult to compare, so for our number 2 pick we are going with Octagon's middleweight champion Kareem Engazek. Kareem up against Dricus would be one of the most ridiculous fights ever. Kareem is a tanky, forward-moving and pretty slick for his size striker who I believe will try and march down Dricus, who will likely be trying to do the same. At this stage, Kareem hasn't lost a fight in over 10 years, and in his 21 MMA wins he has an over 80% finish rate, while also having an iron chin, never being KO'd or TKO'd. I would class Kareem as a moderate to heavy underdog simply due to his strength of competition, but I'm convinced that this fight would be actually fireworks. My number 1 pick for middleweight is Bellator's middleweight champion Johnny Eblen. If you've never seen Eblen fight, I feel like a middleweight Merab Dvalishvili is an accurate example. A relentless wrestler with insane cardio who will simply outwork you as he has done to each of his 16 opponents in his undefeated MMA career. At 33, Eblen is right on the edge of realistically moving over to the UFC and making a title run, which he has expressed interest in doing for a while now. And with middleweight wide open and him being a stylistic nightmare for essentially everyone in the UFC's top 5, I like Eblen as a slight underdog to near even against Dricus du Plessis. Light heavyweight outside of the UFC is actually one of the weaker divisions in MMA at the moment. Wolfhound in PFL and Corey Anderson in Bellator are honestly barely worth mentioning, so for our number 2 pick against Alex Pereira, I'm going with Octagon's champ, Will Fleury. I'm not one to throw allegations out there, but outside of Uberim, I'm not sure if there's been a more blatant fighter on the juice than Will Fleury at Octagon 65. That is some genuinely crazy PED-induced back knee, and it's not like Will hasn't been caught for using PEDs in the past, so I'm not sure he's even trying to hide it while in Octagon. But you know, that's probably half the reason I picked him. Screw it, let's just send some juiced up Irish lad at Powhatan and see what happens. In all seriousness though, Will is a tough, well-rounded fighter, but he is a heavy underdog against Pereira. Our number 1 pick for light heavyweight is one's former 3-weight champion Anatoly Malachin. I don't care that it was in a very weak one championship with probably like 15 people in total in all 3 of these divisions combined, but still, holding the middleweight, light heavyweight and heavyweight titles at the same time in any major organization is one of the craziest achievements ever in the sport of MMA. Out of his 3 weight classes, I like him best at light heavyweight and can see him easily in the top 3 of the relatively wide open UFC division. Anatoly is an absolute tank with scary power, and if he is willing to eat a few shots from Pereira, I think at the very least he could pose some questions, and if he is more willing to use his insane wrestling pedigree, which he doesn't seem to use often, he quickly becomes a nightmare matchup against Powhatan real quick. He definitely has the chin to eat a few of Pereira's shots and the grappling and cardio to bully him if he can get past the inside boxing of Powhatan. The more I think about this, the more I like 36-year-old Anatoly at near even odds against a 37-year-old Pereira. Styles makes fights, and this is one of the worst possible matchups for the UFC champion. For heavyweight up against John Jones, I'm acknowledging Ryan Bader in Bellator, who often doesn't get the credit for what is an all-time great MMA career, as well as ACA's champion, Evgeny Goncharov. But our number 2 pick is one's heavyweight champion, Omar Khan. If I could have any fighter in this video in the UFC, it would be Omar Khan. An unbelievable physical prospect who has the grappling to hang with Russian master of sports Anatoly Malachin, who we just talked about earlier, but then also has the striking to just brute force his way through almost all his opponents. Umar is an extremely raw talent, and at 32, it's just simply too late for him to close the gap technically to someone like John Jones, but if you give him the game plan to just bull rush Jones and bully him as one of the craziest physical specimens the sport has ever seen, Who knows what could happen? Omar for me is a moderate underdog against Jones, which is crazy to say, but I think Omar is such a physical specimen and good enough technically he should never be considered a heavy underdog against anyone. The obvious number one pick for heavyweight is the lineal UFC champ and what I'm calling the PFL champion, Francis Ngannou. As much as I acknowledge the golden rule of MMA, never betting against Jon Jones, I think Francis has a good chance against the current UFC champion. Francis learning just enough wrestling technique to allow him to utilize his insane physical size and strength in grappling exchanges has, in my opinion, rocketed him into being the best heavyweight in the world, at least during his MMA peak. If I'm feeling a certain way and willing to push a few buttons, which I am today, I'm going to take Ngannou as a slight favourite against Jon Jones. So that's 2 non-UFC champion picks for every male UFC champion who I think has the best chance of giving the UFC champion a solid contest. This video was written and recorded on the 5th of January 2024, but if a champion has changed since then, I'm calling it tough luck. Thank you all for watching, and as always, it means the world. If you have any other champions I might have missed or any disagreements, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next video.